Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Idea Fab Lab podcast. I'm here today with Jason Oliver of Wireroots. Jason, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. It's fantastic to be here. Thanks.
Good. Yeah, thanks for coming on. So I thought we would start where we started last time, which is just sort of an introduction. Who are you? Where are you from?
Yeah, I'd be happy to provide that information. So Jason Oliver, I go by Wireroots because I'm a wire artist. I live in Santa Cruz. I was raised in Santa Cruz, although I've traveled and lived in many parts of the U.S. and spent some time out of the country as well. And I love working with wire. I love creativity. And I love the environment here at the Fab Labs.
Cool. So how long have you been making wire art in general? Did you start with wire art or did you start with a different medium?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story, and then I'll show the video. On the video, I'll show a piece. So I basically worked in corporate America. You don't get any more corporate America than Xerox. Spent most of my life in there. And I never had any aspirations to be an artist. I had zero art training. I know that I loved the creative parts of my job when they existed. But I definitely felt a lack of creativity in the corporate environment I worked. And one day I was downtown Santa Cruz with my kids. And we did this thing where we set up a little art station on the street. So we wanted to have just free art supplies, canvases, markers, and kids could just come do art with us. We didn't get permission, you could just set up on the street. And there was a guy next to me who was working with wire, and it became very intriguing to me. So he told me what kind of wire he worked with. And the story goes, I bought a bunch of this wire and I started working with wire. This is what I do. This is an example of my wire trees. And what happened was I started working with wire and I absolutely loved it. And I kept making trees and kept making trees. I didn't really know what I was doing, but my house ended up full of wire sculptures. So my wife said to me, what are we doing here?
Right.
At that time, I was a full-time corporate guy. So I signed up for a little show in Oakland, primarily just to get rid of all the wire trees that were in our house. And then the light went off that I could actually sell these. And that's where it all started for me.
Okay. And what year was that again?
That would have been 10 years ago. So for
2013 or so?
Yeah, that would have been 2013.
Okay. Gotcha. And where were you making all of your art at that time?
Yeah. So I was doing it all at home. The garage became my studio. The living room became my studio. The backyard became my studio. I pretty much just took over, and I was still working full time for Xerox. And on my spare time, I just loved working with wire. And I just started the process of figuring out my technique and how to make wire trees. And over time, a lot's evolved.
That's pretty interesting because it sounds like you basically are still doing exactly what you started with. You started with the wire trees, you like working with wire, and you just kept doing that.
I kept doing it, but it really kind of transformed.
Right.
So when I first started working with wire, I would just basically make freestanding trees that people could use functionally to hang jewelry or car keys or things from. And then over time, I figured out a way where I could actually make wall art, where I could attach a tree to a piece of wood or a frame and it could hang on a wall. Then the light would shine through the wire and make a really cool shadowing effect.
Oh, that does sound cool.
Yeah. And then over time, I started figuring out that I could actually paint landscapes and then put wire trees over landscapes.
Okay.
And then I started messing around with different mediums, different paints, resin, still incorporating wire.
Okay.
That was sort of the journey I was on.
Right. And so did it intentionally start with the functional art? Because that's pretty unusual. I think a lot of people, at least for me when I did art in school, was, like pencil on paper. You couldn't use it for anything.
Yeah. So I think it did start as a functional piece. And I think the only thing that kept me going in the early days, and I'll be candid, I didn't really have the skills to make the elaborate kind of trees that I make today. Doing thousands and thousands of trees over years, I figured out a lot of things. But in the early days, there weren't a lot of people working with wire. Wire tree was unique, so the medium got people's attention. And then it was very functional. So when I went to shows, it's not that I charged exorbitant prices for my work, but it sold. And so that made me feel like, oh, people have an interest in what I'm making. Therefore, I can keep doing this. And it didn't matter to me if it was functional. It didn't matter to me if they viewed it as art. It didn't really matter to me how they used it. I just enjoyed making it. And the fact that people were interested in purchasing it was just kind of like that started the whole process.
Okay. And did you have an art background before this? Because you mentioned you were like full-on corporate Xerox, sort of straight-laced. How'd that happen?
Yeah. So I had zero art training. Yeah, I went to UC Berkeley and had degrees in business-oriented stuff.
Okay.
Cultural-oriented stuff. I had never done anything artistic. And I think that's a big part of the story for me because I can draw a really good tree now that I've learned how to sculpt a tree. But I would really have a hard time drawing. I'd have a hard time painting. I would have a hard time producing, traditional art with the training that I have in a way that would be meaningful and probably be commercial or have value to people. So the fact that I could just start playing with wire and sculpting and doing other things, it sort of spun a different sort of creativity for me. And it's fun, I love the fact that I get to be self-taught and learn that way. Learn through doing, basically.
Right. So you had this, or I suppose your wife had this conversation with you, this come to Jesus, why are there wire trees all over our house? What was the process to go from doing that as a part-time thing while you did your corporate job to actually doing that full-time as an artist?
Yeah, so that's, to me, one of the best parts of the story. So I was a full-time corporate guy in leadership, had, pretty stressful job. And I had time on the side, fortunately, because I got to work from home to do some art, but it was really just basically to kind of feed my soul. It was a hobby. It wasn't a business per se. And what ended up happening was my goal was always to be able to retire at 50. So my plan was to work really hard, save money, retire at 50. And that was my objective. And when I was 46, there was massive downsizing happening in my company. And by the time I was, so by the time I was 47, I was going to be faced with a choice that I would either have to take a job that I really was going to hate or get laid off. So I took the severance package and I convinced my wife, this is the second conversation we had around art, that I could bridge my income with art, albeit not as lucrative as my corporate income, but that this could happen and we could still hit this objective. And it was a really good time for us too, because she happened to be transitioning from basically being a stay-at-home mom to a part-time worker to a full-time worker. So she was going to have really good benefits. And we sort of made that transition.
Okay. So instead of your corporate job providing most or all of the pay and benefits, then you had her providing the benefits with her job, and then you also had art sort of to supplement and grow over time?
Yes. And there were kids in the fold too. So, an important part of the story was I had this really stressful corporate job and my wife got to basically be home and take care of the kids. So, there's this friction that happens in a marriage where it's really tough to take care of kids, especially toddlers. But I had a super stressful job in a company that was downsizing all the time. So neither one of us appreciated each other's stress. So one thing that I said to my wife is I'd always hoped that we could share my job and we could share in parenting. And I'm dyslexic, so I'm a terrible writer. I'm terrible with emails, but I was really good at certain things at work. And my wife is the polar opposite. Everything I'm bad at, she's good at. And so I used to wonder, is there a way where she could do the things I'm bad at in my job and I could do the things I'm good at and I could spend more time with the kids and she could get a break from the kids. And so that was always like a dream for me. Corporate America isn't structured where that sort of an option really exists. But what ended up happening is ultimately my wife went to work full time. I got to do more stuff with the kids and do my art. And so I actually got to, get time with the kids, albeit they were in middle school and, toward the end of grade school, but it was still formative years.
Right.
And I was really grateful for that opportunity. And we gained appreciation for each other because I learned what it's like taking care of the kids, albeit they weren't newborns, but still, I can tell you at those ages, they're challenging.
Yeah.
And she understood what it's like to feel the pressure of being the breadwinner and providing, those things and benefits, etc. So it was good for us on a lot of levels.
Nice. And was it the sort of thing that when you were doing your art at home that your kids would come be a part of it, or were they interested in it all? Are they also artists?
Yeah. So my daughter's really into art. I think she's a great artist. My son loves working with his hands. He's very mechanical. And they would come and check me out. And sometimes they would play around with wire or play around with other medium. So we got to share that experience, which is great.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that seems like a really good spot. A lot of couples that I've known who have that sort of change with a downsize or saying, I'm going to go, it's almost a truism, right? The whole, I'm going to go do art. It's like, what are you doing? So I think that's really cool that you had familial support in order to actually make that work. You mentioned that at that point, when you first started, you were just doing all of your work in your garage throughout your whole house, making your wife question why there's all this wire around. At what point did you decide that you needed to move into a studio, into some place like Idea Fab Labs?
Yeah, so I'll kind of take it in chronological order. So when I first left corporate America, there was a lot of pressure to figure out how we bridge the gap financially. So at that time, I was basically making wire trees physically with my hands, and I was probably selling something like 100 pieces of art.
Wow. That's quite a lot.
Yeah, that means I was producing with my hands 100 pieces of art. It means I was basically going and doing a show, 3 weekends out of the month. So I was working at a very high rate, and it was bringing in income, and that was working. But what I didn't realize is how physically demanding it is when you basically do repetitive motion. I work with construction grade wire. So working with my hands and everything, it became, years into it, basically, I started to develop some tendon issues, some body issues, some physical issues. And it became clear to me it was going to be hard to sustain producing original art unless I just basically made a small amount of pieces for a very high dollar amount to make them all work. So it wasn't so much for me that I needed a different space to work. I have, a decent sized home, a decent sized garage. I've taken over the backyard. I can work from home and keep the expenses low. But Fab Labs provides an environment and equipment that give me a chance to kind of take my business, scale it, and different things. And that was the problem that Fab Labs solved for me.
Okay. I definitely want to get back to that because I'm interested in how exactly. But when you say you were just making these freestanding trees by hand, were you literally using your hands, or was this pliers, or what sort of tools did you use?
Yes, I was working by hand. So, show you the image again. So
people can appreciate this beautiful thing.
Yeah. So, this is mounted on a piece of wood, but if you could imagine a tree, basically, this size or bigger freestanding, I was physically doing all of that with my hands. And not only that, I was taking construction grade wire, rolls of wire, had them hanging on a pole, and I would pull the wire down, I would cut it, bend it, pull the wire down, cut it, and bend it. Just the pulling motion, I've literally I've done the math, and I've made over 3,000 and probably 300 pieces since I've started this. So that's a lot.
That's crazy.
That's a lot of repetitive motion. So yeah, I was doing a lot with my hands. It was all hands, pliers, no machinery. And every time I tried to figure out a way that I could incorporate machinery, the best I could come up with is I did go online and I found a machine that can cut the wire for me.
Oh, okay.
Which is helpful.
Seems pretty good.
Although the machine's a little bit finicky, it doesn't always work right. But I can at least get the wire cut for me most of the time. But it's just too difficult to try to get a machine to replicate the actual twisting of the wire. However, when we get to the Fab Labs part, I can talk about how their equipment has been able to augment what I do.
Okay, sure. Yeah, let's talk about that now because I'm curious. So what sorts of equipment do you use now that you're trying to avoid doing everything by hand?
Yeah, so to get back to the problem statement, so the first problem I had is, about 7 years into this, I had a lot of pain in my arms and shoulders and elbows through, what I perceived to be repetitive motion from all the tree making. What I also found out recently in January is I have a rare form of blood cancer. So I had inflammation in my body that was also making me feel more pain. So I had medical situations going on that was creating me from producing at the level that I wanted to produce. So I would have to take long breaks, which was really hard for an artist. I'd have to do less shows. The other problem that I had was making an original wire sculpture. I can only justify selling that for a certain price point. Whereas, if I could get into more price points, if I could sell something for $25 or $50 or $75, if I could hit different price points with my art, then that would really enable me to grow my business. So people come to a show, they just don't have to pay the minimum for original or the maximum for a really nice original. There's other options for them. Painters are really good at doing prints. So I was like, how can I take wire art and basically manufacture a print from it? So I came into the Fab Labs and they helped me understand that I could basically take a digital image. See this? So this is, there we go. Yeah, so this is basically, the idea here is that we've taken a photograph of one of my wire trees, we've converted it in software, and now there's a machine here that basically can take a piece of wood and it can burn the image of that tree into wood. In this case, it's a tree that's been burned out, and then I've glued it onto another piece of wood. Another example is something like this. And then the example that I showed you earlier with a wire tree that actually has a burn image behind it and a painted background. So what the Fab Labs helped me understand, and I'm still new in the process, I've been here about 7 months, is I can now figure out a way where I can produce something really small that I could sell for $25. I could produce something that I could sell for $40. I could produce something I can sell for $50. I can take a burned image of a tree and just sell that in various sizes. I could even go really big and sell it for a lot more. And I can put a wire tree over it and sell it for a little bit more, but I don't have to make as big of a tree. So essentially what the Fab Labs has done is it's introduced me to the concept that for somebody that does sculpting, there is a way that I can get to prints. And now we're experimenting with basically burning wood trees into wood. Burning digital images into wood. And before I came here, I was just messing around with an earring line. So how can I basically take my images and make earrings and jewelry? So there's a lot of potential here with what the Fab Labs offers. It's just a matter of me learning software and getting different ideas and how I can incorporate what I do with what they offer.
I really like the power of the laser cutters. That's the only tool that I'm actually trained on and signed off on to use because I was pretty excited about it. How did you get the idea to make these prints, so-called? Because that seems to me like a huge game changer, especially if you go from I make this one piece and then I have to sell it and then I start over to now I have this pattern of this tree and now I can make hundreds of them if there's demand.
Yeah, so it kind of came to me in two ways. So I've been doing, one of my favorite shows is the Capital Art and Wine Festival. And I've done that show for the last 6 years.
Is that like an annual show or monthly?
Yeah, it's an annual show every summer. It's a juried event. So basically there's more applicants than there are artist space. So, they choose the artists that they feel best fit that venue or, there's a criteria. I've been fortunate enough to have been invited back the last 4 years, which is a great honor. So they take the top 20% of the artists that fit into a category that says you automatically get into the show without having to reapply. So I've been doing that. And at that show, another artist that I met is also a surfer, and we became friends. He lives down south. He does painting on wood. And I noticed that, his business was substantially larger than mine. And he would sell some of his originals really expensive, but he would be selling a lot more prints. He would postcard prints, wooden prints. Like he could have a really nice offering in prints that fit well with his brand. It was a little bit harder for me, but it became clear to me that I needed to do something. So the idea of like, well, how could I get a print from what I do? And that's where the seed got planted for me. But then there were hurdles. I'd heard about the Fab Labs, but I'm not a software expert. I'm not a photographer. So going from the process of getting a digital image, basically figuring out how to get that image into a format that would then work for a machine. For somebody that has ADHD, getting trained, for hours on how to use a machine.
I understand completely.
Yeah, there's a lot, I'm at the point now where I'm proficient in certain things, but I'm just scratching the surface. You could use this equipment for still be fit.
Yeah, for sure. And you said you'd already heard about the Fab Lab, but had sort of been hesitant. Who did you hear about it from? Was it someone at a show?
Yeah, so actually one of my daughter's friends, so when my daughter was in middle school, one of her friends' dads had been coming to the Fab Labs, and he had helped me do some stuff, with shows before, and he kind of planted the seed like, hey, this place is here. So I at least was aware of it, and I knew it was here. But then it was in the, I guess it was in the January timeframe when I was going through all that stuff, getting diagnosed with cancer, having some of the health stuff. I couldn't physically work with my hands to the degree that I used to, but I needed to have some form of creativity. So that I took that time while my, was dealing with cancer, figuring out how to deal with the cancer and all that kind of stuff, and resting my body to start working with the Fab Lab. So that sort of was the starting point to get me going. Yeah.
Okay. And the biggest things that you wanted to use the tools for are the obviously easy on your body, like we talked about, and there's the duplication, like of the prints that you can use. What sorts of tools did you want to use for the more sophisticated types of art? Because you mentioned earlier you were hoping to find ways to express yourself that you could also sell at higher price points. But what other tools are you looking at? Or is it mostly the laser cutter right now?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple ways to answer that question. So the first part is I can basically, when I do original wire sculpture, I can make pieces that are really massive, and they take a long time to make, and they have a lot of material, and expect to sell those for a lot more, but they're very physically demanding. So that's what, and I've done that. And every show that I generally will bring out a small amount of those larger select pieces. With the Fab Labs, the starting point for me was just basically figuring out how to take the laser machine and burn the image into wood. And what I learned through the process is I can scale up a tree, so I can get a really nice big piece of wood, and I can burn a big tree on there, and I could sell that for more money because of the size and scope of that piece. If I added wire on top of that piece, I could sell it for size and scope. What I have not done yet is get into some of the other machinery that they have. 3D printing is a possibility, especially for some of my smaller designs, and have some stuff in the wood shop that would be pretty interesting. But to be honest with you, there's so much that I'm still figuring out, which is the laser piece.
Yeah.
Earrings are like, a great way to expand my business, smaller pieces. And then, I don't want to get into the weeds, but like...
No, by all means, get into the weeds. I'd love to hear this. And a lot of people who are artists would be so jealous of where you are, that you're able to do it full time and learn more. So please.
All right. So here's an example. So this here is basically just a piece of wood. That's just a natural piece of wood with a tree burned into it. And I love repurposing wood. So I have all kinds of fence wood, barn wood, all kinds of stuff. Anything that can be reused as part of my brand. But, just to basically burn a tree on a piece of wood, that's great. But I love to paint landscapes. So, some of the things I'll do is I might paint a really beautiful skyline, a landscape. I might paint an ocean with a skyline, and then I can burn a tree over that. I didn't bring a piece like that, but I could basically paint a really incredible moon with a dark skyline, and then I could have a tree that basically is windblown over that, over that moon. So basically painting the wood and then going to the machine and doing an image over the wood is pretty cool. And then if I want to, I can add a wire tree on top of that, which gives another amount of dimensionality. I can play with, old windows, or I can take an old window. Yeah, you take an old window with the glass on it, and basically I can print on a piece of wood, a big moon and then, skyline or a landscape. I can have a tree behind that. I can do painting on the other side of the glass, and then I can put a tree over that. So there's dimensionality I can play with. So there's just so much you could do. You can work with a different piece of wood. Different mediums create different results.
Right.
So every once in a while I'll stumble on something mostly by mistake. But the more that you work with the equipment, it's really cool. And you might have an idea of something that you can do, and you come here with your wood that's painted, or is this or is that. And it works out exactly as you expected, or it works out totally opposite, but it's still something that's really cool. Maybe an unexpected surprise.
I am curious, when you talk about the shows that you do, obviously you have the big festival that you've been invited to the last few years. What sorts of places do you take your art, and what sorts of art do you take? Do you take mostly the small scale stuff like this, or do you take your large sculptures?
Yeah, so I'll be happy to talk about that. So when I first started, the very first show that I did was called Treasure Fest.
Treasure Fest.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is great. If anybody's watching this, they just started doing this again. It's fantastic. So basically what they did, and this was, going 9 years ago, they took part of Treasure Island, which sits right in between Oakland and San Francisco, basically, right in between the Bay Bridge. There's a little island. It's called Treasure Island. And it used to be largely a military installation, and they had a lot of vacant land. And there would be about 500 vendors that would come in of all different types, some selling art, some selling, used goods, food trucks, music, the whole thing. It was a big festival. And that's where I got my start. And that show would happen the first weekend of every month. And I did that show religiously. I love that show. So that's sort of where I got my start. The sad thing about Treasure Fest is eventually they started developing the island.
Oh, so there wasn't all the land.
The show got kicked out. But starting this February, they found enough space to accommodate close to 600 vendors. And I will be there for the grand reopening February, the first weekend of February. I will be there. And I will plan on doing a handful of Treasure Fest shows. I don't think I could do them every month. So I started with Treasure Fest. Then I started hitting the art and wine festivals. So I did Mountain View Art Wine Festival. I did Capitola Art and Wine Festival. I did Los Gatos Art Wine Festivals. Those were really good venues for me. But one of the greatest honors, if anybody is familiar with California Roots, California Roots is a massive reggae festival. They basically take over, it's in Monterey, and they basically take over the fairgrounds for 3 days. It's 3 days of nonstop best reggae bands, starts at noon and ends basically at 11. And it's just bands all day long, multiple stages. It's a huge, huge event. So somebody had seen my work and was a fan of my work, and they approached me to be what's called an active artist. So I was basically chosen to be one of a handful of artists that could basically be outdoors making my work, selling my work, totally free of charge, supported by California Roots, which is fantastic. And the amount of exposure and the amount of sales that I could do at a venue like that with that many people was just phenomenal. So I was fortunate to be invited to do that 3 years in a row. Great. COVID and a few other logistics haven't enabled me to be back. But California Roots, if you're watching, I'd love to come back and do it again. So I did California Roots, Capitola Art and Wine Festival. I've done some fine art shows in other parts of the country. So those are the venues. I sold in stores.
Really?
Yeah. I did a lot of store business. I did Ragged Point Gallery was a big customer of mine. There's a custom-made furniture store in Half Moon Bay. They sold a lot of my work. It's called Cottage Industries. So at various times, I've sold my work through between 3 to 6 retail locations at various places around. Yeah. California Roots was a huge honor. And it was a great experience. And I met artists there. Some of them still follow me on Instagram, and a couple come to name. Mike Pino was a great guy. He came by my booth. His wife is an arborist, and so I got to gift them some art, and he's been really kind to me with his music. Another band called the Hip Abduction, which is a great band. I love their music.
It's a great name.
Yeah, I got to see them and gift them some work and go backstage and spend some time with those guys. So it's connected me with other artists. And, when I'm making my art, I'm always listening to music, and reggae is one of the genres I love listening to. That's a fun thing. So that was a huge honor. And then the retail space, working with retail and figuring out that, that model is a different thing. But I was happy to support that, and what the retail side of it's all about.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually specifically about the retail or the uninitiated, and I'm definitely one of those. That seems almost the point where you've made it as an artist. You're legit, your stuff is in stores. How do you go from these festivals on a weekend to actually being in a store and having the support of retail?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So
Thanks.
Essentially how it kind of transformed for me was I did a show that tailored to small businesses and to retail stores. So it was a show up in San Francisco. It was a little bit more expensive. And from that show, I got exposed to places like the Cottage in Half Moon Bay, which they just unfortunately closed their store about 6 months ago. But they were like, for 6 years, they sold a lot of my work, all custom handmade furniture. Ragged Point Gallery picked up my work. So there was about 10 different stores that took my work. And of the 10, 5 of them, it was a fit. They ended up being repeat stores for me. So that was sort of how I transitioned into that model. I didn't market to retail stores directly. There are people that come by my booth that either, are attached to a retail business or a winery or something else. And they say, would you be interested in selling, or would you be interested in signing, or something like that?
Okay.
At this stage, for me, it's less about volume and more about value. So my goal isn't to sell everywhere like it used to be. I'd rather just, figure out the amount I can produce, what my body would tolerate, and find the right environment. So I'm a little bit more selective about it. But that's how I transitioned into basically the retail front. Now, the only area that I haven't transitioned into is the real fine art, where you're in the galleries and selling for really a high premium. And that's a direction that's a possibility. But I have more fun going the other. So, I've weighed it out and I've looked at it. I would much rather produce art and work with the Fab Labs and have stuff at different prices and go to shows and be able to see my art reach people's homes and get art that they can afford. And, that feels good to me. So if I can, figure out a way to make the economics work, that volume is more for me selling a few pieces for a lot of money.
Okay, fair enough. And you mentioned earlier that COVID had interfered with some of your events. I know everybody's tired of talking about COVID, but what did that do to your business, and how has recovering from that been?
Yeah, so, COVID was just a killer for the retail store. So the Cottage Industries handmade furniture in Half Moon Bay. They'd been in business forever, and they had a great following, and they sold a lot of my work. COVID hit, so naturally their business was greatly impacted on retail space, especially in the And I think one of the, I don't know all of the ins and outs as to why the store was closed, but I have a feeling COVID played a big factor in Ragged Point Gallery. You know, they're basically an inn with a high-end gift store, basically on the Big Sur coast. COVID hit, that business dropped drastically. Shows were all but canceled. The only good news for me is when all that happened, I was also physically recovering from some of the other issues so it was healthy for me to have a break, but unfortunately a lot of the places that were thriving, just in general, exclusive of my art, that happened to be good venues for my art to be sold, that greatly impacted that. And then all the art shows were basically shut down. So it was a pretty big impact. People did contact me. I did some commissions and stuff.
And that was through your website primarily, or through Instagram or something?
I do have a website, www.wireroots.net.
I'll put that in the description as well.
Great. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's @Wireroots. So yes, there are lots of ways people can interact with me.
Okay, very cool. And when did things sort of pick up again post-COVID? Because I know for some businesses, they basically did nothing for 6 months and then went right back to it, and some was a number of years. What was that like for you?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So I would say the first year, everything was pretty much shut down. The next year, it was like, okay, how can we, stores are figuring out how they can reopen, how can they maintain their retail space. Obviously, there was lots of government funding that was taking place to help, artists and help stores and everybody stay afloat, which is nice. But I would say what happened is about 2 years after COVID is when things started to get to a little bit more normalcy. Outdoor shows started to resume. And as a matter of fact, it happened so quick, I wasn't ready for it.
Oh, really?
I had to turn down shows because I didn't have the product stocked up to do the show. And then obviously people started to figure out that, you can do outdoor shows and minimize the risk of COVID. You can do outdoor shows with masks and really minimal risk. So it took a little while, but about 2 to 3 years was about the point where I think things really changed. But unfortunately for some businesses, they just never recovered.
Well, I'm glad that your business seems to recover a bit.
Yeah. Just as a build on that, I did Capitol Art and Wine Festival this September, and my sales were up about 30% from the prior year.
Oh, very nice.
And I attribute about 70% of that to having an expanded product line that the Fab Labs helped me out. So for me, this concept of expanding my product and basically being able to have a combination of original art and some of their prints, etc., it definitely is a concept that is proving to be successful.
You've mentioned a few times that a lot of your transition in your business is because of physical limitations. Are there other people who you work with? Do you hire other artists, or do you collaborate with other artists to be able to produce more in spite of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea has come along many times. So God bless him, my son's almost 19. I had a bunch of wire that wouldn't work on my machine, so my son's cut wire for me. I had aspirations of training my kids around, maybe they could take over
the family business.
Yeah. Not that it's a business empire or juggernaut, but I thought it could be a nice side hustle for them. And they didn't really, I didn't feel the passion of it. My daughter likes to make earrings, and they'll kind of help do shows with me and do that. And then honestly, I thought about, well, is there somebody I could mentor, develop, and bring them along? And my experience is I've always been open to sharing what I do and how I do it. And early on, a lot of people were fascinated with what I was doing. So I showed lots of people how to work with wire. And what ended up happening is a few of these people basically just did exactly what I did. I mean, I don't know, there you go. Exactly what I did, but they even the design, every aspect of how I would make a piece, it was basically like copycat scenario.
Right.
And that always felt a little bit weird for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it had a major negative impact on my business, but it just felt a little bit strange.
Right.
So then I was like, okay, if I bring somebody in and I train them, at some point, if I'm exiting altogether, it makes sense to just go off and have fun. But while I'm in this in-between phase where I still think I would like to have this be a viable business for me for a while, it's sort of hard to understand how I incorporate those elements.
Right.
The other challenge is, low overhead is everything for an artist.
Right.
So my house is a fixed cost.
Mm-hmm.
If I can work from my house, then, I don't add an additional cost.
Right.
Fab Labs charges a monthly fee, which is fine. It's definitely a worthwhile thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not really set up for insurance and all the kind of stuff to basically, have somebody come in and work in my house and the liability that goes with that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a liability factor, there's a risk factor, and then there's just an intellectual property factor.
Right.
And thus far, there hasn't been an obvious solution for me in those.
When I spoke to the directors of Liminal Space last week, their solution was basically to ignore that and only meet people in third spaces. So, for example, only do collaboration with other people who are already at IFL, because then you don't have to bring them to your house. Although, obviously, the intellectual property kind of aspect, that does sound a bit challenging, especially with the types of things that you're making, especially going into like this sort of thing that is more reproducible. Does sound like an interesting challenge. Do you mind if I ask you a few more questions about the business side of things?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Because and I already mentioned this, but to me, it seems like you're an artist who's made it, in a sense. Right. Like you're actually doing the business of being an artist, which is very cool, because it's the sort of thing that to me seems like going to be a movie star or something like that. Like that theoretically is possible, but I don't talk to people who have done it. Right. You mentioned
far less glamorous, by the way, though.
Oh yeah, well,
that's fine. I get the
I'll take your word for it. I've never done either. You mentioned you had to turn down shows because you didn't have enough product, and at the time, that was when you were focusing on huge volume of product. Sure. How much product do you plan to sell in a show, and how much do you bring in order to have that happen?
Yeah, gosh, that's a great question. I did it. The numbers escape me because I wrote it all down. But when I
doesn't have to be exact.
Yeah, like when I did the Capitol Art and Wine Festival, I built a build plan, knowing that I had now products for, from the Fab Labs. So my build plan said, okay, I want to have 50 pieces that I could sell for $25.
Okay.
And I want to have, I want to have 75 pieces that I could sell for $30. And I want to have, 50 pieces that I could sell for $75. And so when I went into Capitol Art and Wine Festival, I didn't get to my build plan exactly.
Okay.
But I had hundreds of pieces.
Okay.
And I sold about 70% of the inventory, maybe 80, what I brought to the show. So a big show, you can sell a lot of pieces.
Sure.
Especially if you can hit different price points.
Right.
So there's definitely that part of it. And you mentioned the business side of it. So I was a corporate guy.
Right.
I started out as a corporate sales rep, as a sales manager and area director, eventually a vice president. So I did all of the corporate stuff.
Right.
So when I came into the art spectrum, I didn't have this notion of I make something and I need to get this for it.
Right.
My going in hypothesis was what I make is worth what somebody's willing to pay for. Right. And if that doesn't end up being a lot of money, it doesn't make me, lesser of a person. It's just a reality.
Right.
So for me, the business side of the art was to understand, okay, what do I make and what value does it have for people? And I figured out clever ways to understand what my market value was for my art, which we could discuss.
I would love to, yeah.
But that was how I did it. A lot of people have this fixed idea that it needs to be a certain thing.
Sure.
And I just don't think that meshes with the customer. So I tried to meet the customer where they were at.
Okay.
So you want me to share about that?
Yeah, the question I had sort of as a lead-in was you mentioned thinking about it in terms of price points,
Yes.
X amount of things for 25, X amount of things for 30. Do you always think about it in terms of price points, or do you sometimes think about it in terms of I want 30 of this particular piece or 25 of this particular piece?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So since I started working with Fab Labs, I started thinking in price points, knowing that I wanted to get to different price points. Like I didn't want to just basically only be able to sell a small original piece that had to start at 75.
Right.
And then, a much nicer piece at 150 and 350 and 450, so on.
Right.
So I realized with the Fab Labs, gosh, I could start at 25. I didn't be able to start at 20 for a really small piece.
Right.
So that got me thinking about price point or around.
Okay. And how, so now I'd love to talk about it. How do you determine your price points where you say this is worth X amount or I want a product that's worth Y amount?
Yeah. So my corporate training taught me that voice of the customer market data is the most important thing.
Okay.
So how I figured out my price points really came about in a few different strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Number one is I sold at shows long enough to understand that when I was selling something too low and it was selling too quickly, and people were telling me I was selling it too low, they weren't just being nice. I probably should be selling that for a little bit more.
Okay.
So I developed a market understanding from shows that I was doing, and it varies per show around what my pieces are worth. When you sell in a retail environment, basically, you sell to them for wholesale and they basically double it plus whatever, because they're shipping and other costs. So when you sell in a retail environment, you understand that, if you're moving a fair amount of pieces every month that are selling, at a really high retail price, that's a market indicator.
Right.
My web pricing was a market indicator. I always made sure that my website pricing was never less than what stores would sell.
Right.
But the most interesting way that I understood price points was every show that I would do, especially like a big Capital Art and Wine Festival, I would take a handful of pieces and I would do what's called an open bid.
Okay.
So the concept is you basically designate these pieces. You bring a big piece of paper. Somebody puts their name, they put their phone number, and they put the amount that they want to bid. And when the bid ends, which is usually the last day of the show or at a certain time on a certain day, the highest bid gets the piece.
Gotcha.
So what that taught me was, the way that people would bid on pieces, if a piece was getting a lot of action or a lot of activity, I would really understand what people were connecting with.
Right.
And I would say 9 out of 10 times the ultimate sell price was higher than I would have expected it.
Okay.
So
that's got to be gratifying.
It is gratifying. And what's nice about the open bid is if you write down if you say, gee, I really think that this piece should sell for $450, and you put $450, and a lot of people would look at it, and it might be rare that, over the course of the day, someone's going to be like, yeah, here's $450.
Right.
But, somebody might be like, wow, $50, I'm going to bid on that. And somebody else is like, wow, $75, I'm going to bid on that. And then somebody else is, and then pretty soon people get really invested and they keep coming back to the booth.
Right.
And sometimes, the person that ended up at $450, somebody else is like, you know what, I really want that. I want to pay $475.
Right.
So you might get to a price point that you didn't expect because you did this open bid.
Right.
But you have to be willing to take the risk. It may sell for a lot less than you thought it would.
Right.
But that's market data for me, and I have no problem taking.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you. I've never heard of that as I previously, I know this podcast isn't about me, but I've previously done work where I've been at shows and things like that too. And I've never seen any open bid like that. So yeah, that's very interesting.
It's really strange. I did a show, I did that California Root show, and somebody did an open bid, and I thought it was genius. Yeah. And then I did it. The next show I did was Capital Art and Wine Festival, and I open bid 2 pieces, and it went really well. And then this last show that I did, I think I open bidded 15 pieces.
Wow.
And I bidded different types of pieces. I stuff that I produce at the Fab Labs, I bid it because I wasn't sure how to price it.
Mm-hmm.
So I really tried to figure out my market by bringing different types of pieces, knowing that some, smaller pieces, bigger pieces, medium-sized pieces.
Right.
It's market data.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why more people don't do it. I think some people are just really stuck on, I name my price,
Yeah.
But for me, the open bid is fantastic.
Yeah.
That probably was 25% of my sales the last show I did.
Really? Wow.
A pretty significant piece of your overall.
Yeah. So any aspiring artists, do the open bid. You heard it here first.
That's a great idea. Now you gotta know the right venue. Treasure Fest is a bit different.
Yeah, right.
They're not drinking wine. They're not there the whole weekend. They're there for a few hours and they're gone. So
Gotcha.
I found like open bidding at Treasure Fest isn't as successful as like an art and wine festival.
Okay.
But I still think it's a great idea, especially if you're starting out.
Right.
Because you need to figure out, you need to understand what your market is. And that's the best way to get that market fee.
Okay. Cool. Actually, speaking of advice to young artists, is there anything that you've learned in the last 10 years that you really wish you had learned or that you knew when you started out?
Well, I don't really think that there's something that I wish I would have done differently. The only thing in my case is I wish I would have fully comprehended the physical impacts that took place at the level that I was producing.
Right.
I just loved doing it and I kept doing it. Eventually my body said, oh,
can't do that anymore.
Make a change.
Yeah.
So, maybe there was a feeling that I was invincible and I could just keep going because I loved it.
Yeah.
But to young artists, I think that the biggest challenge is, so my daughter is brilliant with TikTok and social media, and I think the younger generation has, an inept ability to market through social media. But then you have to appreciate the business side of it.
Right.
So if I were to advise a starting artist, it would be, how can you basically source your materials for the lowest possible cost? Ideally, repurpose things.
Right.
How can you basically make a product and test what your market is and figure out is it worth your time or can you evolve it to something that then works? And, find the shows and the venues and the places where you can get the smallest cost, and then figure out what your market is. And I think where any new artist or younger generation struggles, it's figuring out the business side of that.
Right.
The name of the game is not necessarily to get rich, but not to.
Right.
So if you spend a lot of money on a show and you don't sell anything that's good, if you spend a lot of money on materials and you don't sell anything that's not good, if you started a show that costs, very little amount of money or it's a free pop-up, if you get materials basically that are repurposed, that are free, it's minimalizing your cost.
Right.
Time is a factor, but, young people have time.
Yeah. More time than money when you're young, for sure.
It's just those tangible costs.
Yeah.
And profit is important. And profit is basically what I spend, and what I get. And you can assess, the hours and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, if I were advising new artists, it would be to be really.
Okay. And you mentioned sourcing materials for as cheap as possible. And you mentioned that at the beginning as well.
Yes.
And I had a note to come back to it. So now seems like a good time.
Sure.
Where did you, let me rephrase, how did you start figuring out where to source those materials? Because you mentioned that you use a lot of repurposed wood, but you haven't mentioned about the wire, for example.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So wire is the most important part of what I do for the originals.
Right.
And what I use is basically baling wire. It's a construction grade wire. And when I started, you could buy a roll for about $3.50.
Oh,
I haven't bought some for a while, but it got up to $7 a roll. The price is up a lot.
Yeah.
But there's 400 feet of wire in a roll. So I figured out where I can source, that material through construction grade suppliers, at volume that makes sense for me. And so that's a cost that I have some control. Now, when I make a physical tree, I generally attach it to a wooden frame or a wooden back. And and that there seems to be no end to opportunities to get fence wood, barn wood,
Right.
reclaimed wood. Old windows can basically become frames. Go into Goodwill and thrift stores, you can find all kinds of stuff.
Okay.
So what I've been able to do is basically figure out a way that things that would basically complement the wire structure, the wood, the frames, the other things, I get those basically free for the part. I have a full yard full of fence wood.
Oh.
Here's a nice hack. Those of you that like to, hardwood floors, right? So when you go pick out a hardwood floor,
Yeah.
they have like 1 million samples.
Yeah.
They're these big squares.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at those things and say, I want this hardwood floor. Where every 2 years they throw those things.
Really?
Yes. So here's an example. So one of these big hardwood floors, it was a big sample. I have somebody that I know that works at him, and he calls me, and I take them, and those basically can be burned into.
Okay.
So I took one of those things, sauna wood, the place that I work out, they replaced the sauna. I basically made a huge piece of sauna. I etched one of my massive trees into this thing.
Uh-huh.
I think I sold that piece for about $460.
Wow.
It took a while for it to burn into the piece, but the wood cost me $0.
Right.
The floorboards cost me $0.
Right.
That's wood cost me $0.
Okay.
And then, paint is another thing. I spray paint other paints,
Mm-hmm.
finding paints on sale, finding cheap.
Right.
That's all an important part of it.
Okay. So other than the happening to know someone who is tearing out a sauna,
Right.
do you normally look, you mentioned Goodwill, do you also use things like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace? Are there any other really good places that you found a lot of success getting these materials from?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I'll kind of go down the list. So when I first started, I would go onto Craigslist, and I found a guy that had a really old fence, and he would sell fence boards for a couple bucks a piece. Bought a bunch of fence boards.
Right.
And pretty soon I realized, where I live in an older neighborhood. Fences are breaking down all the time, and I'm just walking around in the neighborhood, and so, it's like it's to the point now where like I almost have to turn down fence wood sometimes because there's so much to come through. So, you can go on Craigslist, but you can also notice that fences are being torn down. And here's the trick. When somebody's building a new fence, they would be happy to have somebody take away the old.
Right.
The contractors love it.
Right.
I have a guy that, calls me sometimes, and I have to say, I can't take any more.
Right.
So you can do that. Goodwill's great. Thrift stores are great. There's lots of different ways depending on what you're doing. And I figured out how to work with fence wood. I can make frames. I can do so many different things. What?
Right.
So, that's another part of my evolution is I had to figure out basically how to use new tools and build and,
Right.
Get nail guns, build a workspace and do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But that's an option.
Yeah. And you have all this, if you have all this fence wood, you do kind of have to figure out what to do with it at a point.
Yeah. It's a really tough thing because, when you're doing a lot of shows, you burn through material really quick, and then you find yourself low.
Right.
And then you get offered all this material, but then you don't have shows for a while. So,
right.
Storing material and making sure that your wife's not happy with, the state of your backyard and your garage,
right.
which I have not perfected, by the way.
Okay.
That's a challenge.
Well, maybe the next podcast guest will have some ideas for how to store wood in your old kids' rooms without your wife getting mad.
Is do a trade with somebody that can help with the organization.
Yeah.
That would be a really...
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, cool. That pretty much brings us up to present. Are there any, is there anything else you think we should talk about? Like what's next for Wireroots?
So, the elephant in the room, as I said, I was diagnosed with cancer in January.
Yeah.
So, I guess I would just kind of close on this thought. So what happened for me is I had a lot of pain in my shoulders and my arms. And a lot of it was due to repetitive motion and thousands of sculptures doing this nonsense.
Right.
But it turns out a big part of that is I had a lot of inflammation in my body.
Right.
So I started actually my 6 month of chemo. So I've been on treatment the last 6 months, and the inflammation levels have gone down. So I'm able to produce at a higher level.
Right.
So what I would say is what's next for me is in January, I was diagnosed with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
In February, I was severely depressed. I couldn't work with my hands. I had a lot of inflammation going on.
Yeah.
And it started, we weren't even sure what we were going to do for treatment. So I came to the Fab Labs and I started figuring out how I could start doing stuff here without, putting too much pressure on my body.
Yeah.
And then eventually my body started to do better and I could produce work. And now I'm in this really weird space where like some of my art was created because I was in a lot of pain. Some of my art was created with a lot of emotion because I was processing having cancer.
Yeah.
Some of the creativity is coming because I'm exposed to new mediums and equipment and ways to do things.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, the story's still being written. But I think the opportunity for me now is to say, okay, how do I coexist with this form of blood cancer?
Right.
How do I maximize low inflammation levels in my body? How do I maximize my health? And how do I still have creativity be a core thing for me? And I think all of those things are going to come together. And I think I'm going to produce a lot of emotion.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but I know that I'll be able to do more than I had been doing the previous year.
Right.
Because I have Fab Labs to help me supplement my business. My body's doing physically better since I started treatment.
Right.
So I'm excited to start doing more shows. And the more you produce and the more you work, the more that the creativity kind of takes. That's what
Very cool. And people will be able to see the shows that you're going to on your website and
Instagram. So a little bit of a plug.
Yeah, please.
I'm doing Sunday I'm doing a little pop-up at La Madrona, which is a place where I work out. It's just a thing in Scotts Valley. The Sunday before Christmas, I'll be on Pacific Avenue for the Santa Cruz Makers Market. So if you haven't got any Christmas shopping done and it's a week before Christmas, there'll be a bunch of vendors set up on the street there, basically from the bookshop Santa Cruz all the way to Verb.
Okay.
So Pacific Avenue. And then the first weekend of February, I'll be doing Treasure Fest on Treasure Island. And that will be a fantastic show, the reopening of Treasure Fest after it being closed for 7 years.
I'm probably going to try to go to that.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool.
And I'm planning on doing Capitol Art and Wine Festival in September of next year. And in between then, I haven't decided how many Treasure Fests and other shows I'll work in.
Sure.
It'll be dependent on physical and other stuff.
Yeah, of course, where things are.
That's the plan.
All right, cool. Any closing words for our wonderful audience?
No, I would just say, getting back to Fab Labs, what's cool about the Fab Labs environment is they have this machinery that's opened my eyes to new opportunities. But there are people here that understand this machinery and they work with me and they're really kind and they show me stuff. And it's a collaboration that happens on a monetary exchange. It's just people wanting to help one another.
Yeah.
So I think if you're curious to what that part of it's like, if you decide to, join the Fab Labs, you're a part of a community that wants to support one another and what you're doing. You can learn what other people are doing. And, I'm happy to share my experience, strength, and knowledge around the business side of this. And people are all too happy to help me on how to use the machinery and the equipment and other stuff.
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity to collaborate, and I would encourage people out.
Yeah, anyone who's in Santa Cruz. There's links down below as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's good for today. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. This has been fun.
All right.